The sky over Pittsburgh that Thursday morning in January of 1998 was the color of cold steel, the kind of pale gray that promised more snow and offered no mercy. 7 miles north of the city, where the Allegheny River bent westward through a corridor of frozen industrial land, a man named Frank Halloran stood on the riverbank in a Carhartt jacket 2 sizes too big and watched everything he had built over 26 years sink slowly into the water. The crane was still there. 80 tons of yellow steel half submerged, its counterweight rising from the river like the back of some prehistoric animal that had crawled out of the mud to die. The boom was buried 4 feet deep in the river bottom. The cab was tilted at an angle that made Frank's stomach turn every time he looked at it. 4 days. 4 days since the outrigger pad had punched through what the soil engineers had certified as stable ground. 4 days since Frank had watched his crane operator scramble out of the cab seconds before the whole machine tipped and the boom swung toward the river like a falling tree. Nobody had been killed. Frank reminded himself of this every hour. The operator had walked away with a sprained wrist in a story he would tell for the rest of his life. Nobody had been killed. That was the only piece of good news Frank Halloran had received in 96 hours. The bad news came in waves. The Riverside Bridge project, $12 million in contracts, was stopped cold. Halloran Construction had penalty clauses written into every page of that agreement, and the meter was running at $18,000 a day. The crane itself, a mini towak that had cost his company $600,000 when his father bought it in 1979, was probably destroyed. River water and freezing temperatures and 4 days of mud working its way into every bearing and hydraulic line. The insurance adjuster, a man named Reinhardt, who had the soft voice of an undertaker, was coming Monday morning to declare it a total loss. And then there was Catherine. Frank's wife had received the diagnosis on a Tuesday in November. Stage 2, the doctor had said, and they had used that word with the careful neutrality of people trained not to lie, but not to comfort either. The surgery was scheduled for February. The bills had already started to arrive, white envelopes stacking on the kitchen counter like snow on a windowsill. Frank had not opened most of them. He had been too busy watching his crane fail to come out of the river. Behind him, the Pemberton Heavy Recovery Team was packing up for the day. Their 200-ton hydraulic crane sat on the access road, its outriggers retracted, its operator drinking coffee from a thermos and avoiding eye contact. The lead engineer, a young man named Brad Pemberton, had spent the last 2 hours explaining to Frank in calm professional tones why this could not be done. The ground along the bank was saturated. The winter thaw had been earlier and harder than expected. To position the recovery crane close enough to the water, they would need to bring in pile drivers, lay temporary roadways, build a foundation of crushed stone 4 feet deep across 40 yards of riverbank. 3 weeks, Brad had said, maybe 4, and no guarantee. Frank did not have 3 weeks. He had until Monday morning, when Reinhardt the undertaker arrived with his clipboard and his terrible kindness, and after Monday he would have nothing. He turned and walked back toward his truck. The wind off the river cut through his jacket like the cold was personal, like it knew his name. He thought about driving home and sitting at the kitchen table with Catherine and telling her that the company her father-in-law had built in 1971 was going to die before the end of the month. He thought about telling his crew of 43 men that there would be no paychecks after next Friday. He thought about Catherine's surgery and the bills and the house on Tilbury Avenue where his children had grown up. The radio in his truck was on when he opened the door. Police scanner. Frank kept it on out of old habit, a habit his father had given him, the habit of a contractor who needed to know about traffic and weather and accidents that might affect his crews. The dispatcher was reading out a routine call when a different voice cut in, an old man's voice, low, patient. There was a faint Slovak rhythm in it, even though the English was perfectly clean. Halloran Construction, this is for the supervisor at the Allegheny Bridge site. My name is Walter Brennan. I heard about your crane. I believe I can help you. 40 miles southeast of the bridge, in a small frame house on a hill above the Monongahela River in Homestead, Pennsylvania, a 73-year-old man sat at his kitchen table and put down the microphone of an old CB radio. Walter Brennan had not made a call like that in 22 years. The kitchen was small and clean and had not changed since 1971, when Margaret had picked out the linoleum and the yellow curtains in the small formica table where Walter now sat alone. Margaret had been dead for 3 years. The chair across from Walter had not been sat in by his wife in 1,096 days, and Walter knew the number because he counted every morning when he made coffee for one and looked at the empty chair and felt his life shrink another notch. On the wall above the table was a black and white photograph in a wooden frame. Two men standing in front of a truck. The truck was a 1948 Autocar DC, 100 boxy and angular and powerful, with a custom fabricated boom, rising 24 feet above the bed. The older man in the photograph wore a wool cap and a coat too thin for the weather. He had Walter's eyes, or rather, Walter had his, and his hand rested on the fender of the truck, the way a farmer might rest his hand on a good horse. Stephen Brennan, Walter's father. Dead 22 years now, in a hospital bed in McKeesport, with his hand around Walter's hand saying nothing, because the cancer had taken his voice 3 days before it took the rest of him. The younger man in the photograph was Walter at 26. The picture had been taken in 1951. Walter looked at his father in the photograph, and then he looked at the bill of sale on the table in front of him. The man's name was Dennis Karchner. He owned a small wrecker service in Greensburg, and he had answered Walter's classified ad in the Pittsburgh Press. He was driving down on Saturday morning with $12,000 in a cashier's envelope. The autocar would go to a working yard in Greensburg where it would haul broken-down trucks off the turnpike. Dennis had seemed like a good man on the phone. He had asked about the boom and the winch ratios, and he had not laughed when Walter explained that the truck had a particular way of working that required patience. Dennis had said he understood patience. He had said his father had been a tow operator too. Walter believed him. Walter had still cried after he hung up the phone. He had told himself many things over the past month as he had walked through the motions of preparing to sell the truck. He had told himself that he was 73 years old and his back was going and his knees were worse than his back. He had told himself that nobody called for old wreckers anymore, that the modern recovery companies had all the equipment, that the work had passed him by sometime in the early 1980s, when the steel mills closed and the heavy industry that had needed his kind of help simply ceased to exist. He had told himself that his son did not want the truck. Michael was 41 years old and lived in Seattle and wrote computer code for a software company. Michael had visited Pittsburgh twice in the past 5 years. He had stood in the garage and looked at the auto car with the polite blank expression of a man looking at his grandfather's farm implements in a museum. Michael had no use for the truck. He had no use for any of it. So Walter had decided to sell. But the morning of the sale was still 2 days away, and on this Thursday morning the kitchen radio had brought him the voice of a man named Frank Halloran calling for the Pemberton Heavy Recovery Dispatcher, and Walter had heard the desperation in the voice, and he had heard the engineers explaining why the work could not be done, and something had moved in him that had not moved in years. The ground won't hold. That was the phrase that had reached him through the static of the police scanner. The ground won't hold our crane close enough to the water. Walter had stood up from his kitchen table and walked to the window that looked out over his small backyard toward the garage, where the autocar had sat for 22 years. The garage was a separate building larger than the house with double doors that Stephen had built himself in 1949. Walter started the truck twice a year in spring and fall to keep the seals from drying out and the battery from dying. Otherwise, the autocar sat in the dark under a canvas tarp with its custom boom touching the ceiling, waiting for work that no longer came. You don't need to get close to the water if your boom is tall enough. Walter had said the words out loud in his empty kitchen with no one to hear him except the photograph of his father. Stephen had said those words first. In 1962, on a flooded riverbank 20 miles south of the bridge site, when a coal barge had broken loose and rammed into a dock and a Mercury sedan had ended up half in the water. The local wreckers had refused the job. The river was too high, the ground was too soft. So, Stefan had backed the autocar up to a stand of old oak trees, run his cable through a series of snatch blocks, and pulled the Mercury out from 40 yards back without ever getting his front tires onto soft ground. Walter had been 37 years old that day. He had watched his father work, and he had understood for the first time what the truck had been built to do. The work had not gone away. The men who knew how to do it had gone away. Walter walked back to the kitchen table. He picked up the bill of sale. He looked at Dennis Karchner's name and the dollar amount and the date and the careful pencil markings where he had signed his name 3 times the night before. He picked up his coffee cup, which was still half full, and he carried both the bill of sale and the coffee to the kitchen sink. He tore the bill of sale into 8 pieces and dropped them in the sink and turned the water on and watched them disintegrate. Then he picked up the kitchen phone and dialed the number for Halloran Construction. The receptionist tried to put him through to a sales department. Walter said he was not selling anything. Walter said he was offering to help. The receptionist asked his name and his company. Walter said he had no company. He said his name was Walter Brennan, and he had worked at Jones and Laughlin Steel for 42 years, and he had heard a man named Frank Halloran on the police scanner, and he believed he could pull the crane out of the river. The receptionist put him on hold for 2 minutes that felt like 20. Then Frank Halloran's voice came on the line. The conversation was short, and the conversation was strange. Walter explained in plain words the principle that had been in his head since 1962. You do not need to get close to the water. You need a tall boom and stable ground in the right angle. You need to coax the load, not fight it. The Pemberton recovery crane was too heavy and too low. The autocar was lighter and taller, and it could work from solid earth 80 feet back from the riverbank. Frank Halloran was silent for a long time after Walter finished. Mr. Brennan, Frank finally said, I've got an 80-ton crane in the river and a 200-ton recovery crane that can't pull it out. Why should I believe a man I've never met can do it with a wrecker his father built 50 years ago? You shouldn't, Walter said. You should come look at it yourself and decide. There was another silence. What do you charge? Frank asked. Nothing. Sir, I can't accept that. Mr. Halloran, I'm 73 years old. I have no use for your money. I have use for the truck. The truck has use for the work. Come look at it. Frank Halloran gave Walter the address of the bridge site, and Walter wrote it down on the back of the destroyed bill of sale that he had fished out of the kitchen sink. He hung up the phone. He stood in his kitchen and looked at the photograph of his father and the empty chair where his wife had once sat, and the wall calendar that still showed November because he had not bothered to turn the page in 2 months. Then he walked out to the garage and pulled the canvas tarp off the autocar and ran his hand along the cold steel of the boom his father had welded together in 1949. All right, Walter said to no one and to everyone. All right, Pop, one more time. 2 hours later, the autocar rumbled down the access road of the Riverside Bridge construction site at a steady 25 miles an hour, and 43 construction workers and 12 recovery crew members and one site supervisor named Frank Halloran stopped what they were doing and stared. The wrecker looked like it had driven out of a black and white photograph and into the present by mistake. The cab was angular and military green. The boom rose above the bed like a small steel cathedral. The whole machine made a sound that no modern truck makes, a deep mechanical breathing that came from a 6-cylinder engine designed before the Korean War. Brad Pemberton was the first to laugh. He was 38 years old and had 2 engineering degrees and a recovery crane that had cost his father's company $800,000, and he stood next to that crane now, with his arms crossed, and watched the old autocar pull up to the staging area, and he started laughing, the kind of laugh that was meant to be heard. Frank, Brad called out loud enough for his men and Frank's men and the old man climbing down from the truck to all hear at once. Tell me this isn't your plan. Frank Halloran said nothing. He walked across the gravel toward the autocar. Walter climbed down from the cab the slow way, one careful step at a time, with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints had carried him through 42 years inside a steel mill and 22 years after. He wore a gray work coat and a wool cap and steel-toed boots that were older than Brad Pemberton's engineering license. He took off his right glove and held out his hand to Frank. Mr. Halloran, Mr. Brennan. They shook. Frank's hand was cold and Walter's was colder, and behind them Brad Pemberton was still laughing, and somewhere over the river a single crow called out across the frozen water like it was announcing something that none of them had words for yet. Walter Brennan did not look at the crane in the river first. He looked at the ground. For 20 minutes he walked the bank of the Allegheny slow and methodical, stopping every few paces to push a 4-foot steel probe into the earth and read the resistance through his palm. He walked away from the water and back toward it. He walked upstream to where the bank rose into a low rocky shelf, and then he walked downstream to where the construction company had piled crushed stone for the access road. He knelt twice, peeled back the frozen crust with the edge of his boot, and studied the soil underneath. Brad Pemberton watched him from the staging area and shook his head, and said something quiet to his crew that made two of them laugh. Frank Halloran walked beside Walter for part of the survey in silence, like a man trailing a doctor through a hospital ward. He did not ask questions. He did not understand most of what Walter was looking for. He understood only that nobody from Pemberton Heavy Recovery had walked the bank like this. They had measured. They had calculated. They had not walked it. After 20 minutes, Walter stopped at a low rise about 80 feet back from the water. The ground there was firmer, slightly elevated, and the soil under the frozen surface had the dry brown color of stable clay. Two concrete Jersey barriers sat at the edge of the access road placed there by the road crew weeks earlier and forgotten. Here, Walter said. Here what? Frank asked. This is where the truck goes. The barriers are my second anchor. I run the cable through 3 snatch blocks. Mechanical advantage of 6-to-1. I'm not lifting the crane. I'm breaking the suction in the mud and shifting the weight onto the boom's pivot point. Once it starts to move, the river current actually helps. The water wants to take it downstream. I just have to give it permission. Frank looked at the river. He looked at the crane half submerged 40 yards out. He looked at the 80 feet of solid ground between Walter's chosen spot in the water. Mr. Brennan, he said, I don't understand half of what you just said. You don't have to. Brad Pemberton walked over then with the slow, casual stride of a man who had decided to enjoy himself. He had a clipboard under his arm and a slight smile on his face, and he stopped in front of Walter and waited until Walter looked up. Mr. Brennan, I'm Brad Pemberton. I run heavy recovery for Pemberton. I have a question. Go ahead. Are you currently licensed to operate commercial heavy recovery equipment in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania? Walter looked at him for a long moment. My license expired in 1996. That's what I thought. Brad turned to Frank. Frank, I have to say this for the record. You let this man operate equipment on this site and something goes wrong, you don't have an insurance claim. You have a criminal liability. The Commonwealth doesn't care that he used to be a steel worker. They care about paperwork. Frank's jaw tightened. He looked at Walter. He looked at the crane in the river. He looked at the recovery crane sitting useless on the access road. He thought about Catherine and the surgery and the white envelopes on the kitchen counter and the 43 men on his payroll. Brad, Frank said quietly, walk away. Frank, listen to me. Walk away. I'm signing a personal indemnity. Anything that happens on this site from this moment forward is on me. Not Halloran Construction, not your company, me, my house, my personal assets. Walk away. Brad Pemberton stared at him for a long second. Then he laughed once, short and sharp, and walked back toward his recovery crew. Walter Brennan watched him go. Mr. Halloran, he said, you shouldn't do that for an old man. I'm not doing it for an old man. I'm doing it for my company. Show me what you need. What Walter needed took 2 hours to set up. He backed the autocar into the spot he had chosen on the low rise. He set the parking brake and chocked the rear wheels with heavy wooden blocks he carried in the truck bed. He ran out his main cable 3/4 of an inch of woven steel and walked it across the gravel to the first concrete Jersey barrier, where he attached a snatch block with a shackle the size of his fist. He ran the cable through the block and onto the second barrier, where he attached a second block. From there, the cable ran toward the river at a careful angle, calculated to lift forward and up at the same time, not to drag, but to leverage. While he worked, he talked low and steady, more to himself than to Frank, but with Frank listening anyway because Frank had nothing else to do, and because there was something in the old man's voice that pulled him in. My father built this truck in 1949, Walter said, hauling cable through the second block. He bought a bare chassis from a war surplus auction in 1948. Spent 2 years building the boom out of girder scrap from the mill. He'd carry pieces home in the back of his car after his shift. Some nights I'd come out to the garage at midnight and he'd still be welding. Why did he build it? Frank asked. Mill work. Heavy recovery. In the 1940s, the steel mills around Pittsburgh employed 200,000 men. Things broke. Things tipped over. Things fell into rivers. The mills had their own equipment, but the men needed their own help. A working man's truck breaks down on the way to a shift. He can't afford to call a commercial wrecker. So my father built this. He charged what people could pay. Sometimes he charged nothing. How did he make a living? He worked at the mill. The truck was for after work and weekends. He ran a small service from 1950 to 1976. I took it over from him when he died. Worked it through the 80s. By the 90s, the mills were gone. The work was gone. The men who needed it were gone. Frank was quiet for a moment. And you kept it. I kept it. Why? Walter looked up from the cable. He looked at Frank, and then he looked at the auto car, and then he looked past it somewhere only he could see. Because my father told me to. He said one day someone would need it. He said when that day came, I'd know. Frank did not answer. By 11:30 in the morning, the rigging was complete. Walter walked the cable line one last time, checking every shackle and every block, and then he came back to the truck and pulled a pair of chest waders out from behind the cab. Frank looked at the waders. He looked at the river. He looked at Walter. Mr. Brennan, you're not going in the water. I have to hook the cable to the crane frame. Has to be done by hand. Has to be done right. It's 34 degrees, the current's 6 knots. You're 73 years old. Mr. Halloran, I worked 42 years inside a steel mill. I've stood on catwalks 80 feet above molten metal. I've crawled inside a slag pit that was still hot enough to melt my boots. The river won't kill me. Walter pulled the waders on over his pants. Frank watched him do it. The waders were old and the rubber had cracked in places, and Frank could see one of the patches where someone had glued a rip closed with marine epoxy. At least let one of my men go in with you. Your men don't know where to hook the cable. Then tell them. Walter looked up at Frank, then with both straps of the waders half buckled, and his eyes were not unkind, but they were very firm. Mr. Halloran, I have spent the last 3 years sitting in a kitchen by myself, waking up by myself, eating by myself, going to bed by myself. If I die in the river today, that is a better death than the one I have been dying every morning for 1,096 days. Let me work. Frank Halloran did not have an answer to that, so he stepped back and he watched the old man finish buckling the waders and walk down to the water with the cable end over his shoulder. The river was worse than it looked from the bank. Walter felt the cold come through the waders first. The rubber kept the water out, but it did not keep the cold out, and within 30 seconds, his legs went numb from the shins down. He waded out slowly, planting each foot before lifting the next, feeling for the river bottom through the rubber. The current pushed him sideways at every step. He angled himself upstream and walked diagonally across the flow the way his father had taught him on a different river 40 years earlier. The cable was heavy. The cable was very heavy. Walter shifted it across his shoulder and kept walking and tried not to think about his knees. He was 20 feet from the crane when the bottom dropped. He had stepped on what felt like solid silt, and then there was nothing underneath his right foot, and his right leg went down and the river took him. The cable came off his shoulder. The current swept him downstream. He felt his head go under once and come up and go under again. And somewhere on the bank, he could hear Frank Halloran shouting, and somewhere else he could hear his father's voice saying, "You do not fight the river, you let it carry you to something solid," and his hands came up and he grabbed. The crane's boom, half submerged, 40 feet downstream from where he had been. Walter Brennan held onto the boom with both arms and got his face above the water and started to breathe again. He could not feel his legs. He could not feel his hands. He could feel a steel girder under his cheek, and that was enough. He waited. On the bank, Frank Halloran was already in the water. He had run 30 feet into the river before 2 of his men tackled him and pulled him back. The waders that would have saved Frank were on Walter. Frank was in jeans and work boots, and he would have been dead in 3 minutes. The man who reached Walter was Brad Pemberton. Brad had been 20 feet from the river when Walter went down. He had been watching, arms crossed, with the half smile of a man waiting to be proven right. And then the old man had disappeared under the water, and Brad had not thought at all. He had stripped his coat and his boots and walked into the river in his shirt and socks before any of his crew could stop him. He reached Walter at the crane. He hooked one arm around the old man's chest and one arm around the boom, and he held him there gasping, both of them shaking, both of them turning blue, while Frank's men got a rope out to them and pulled them in. When they got Walter on the bank, the first thing he did was look for the cable. The cable was still floating, attached to the snatch block on shore untangled. "Hook," Walter said. His teeth were chattering so hard he could barely get the word out. "Mr. Brennan, you need to get to a hospital. Hook it. While I'm warm, frame, lower left corner, by the operator's cab. There's a lift point." Brad Pemberton, soaking wet and shoeless and shivering himself, stood up from the gravel. He looked at Walter. He looked at Frank. He looked at the river and the crane and the cable still floating in the current. "I'll hook it," Brad said. Frank stared at him. Brad, you just came out of that water. I'll hook it. Get him in your truck. Run the heat. I'll hook it. Lower left corner, operator's cab. Lift point. Yes. Walter nodded once. Brad pulled the chest waders off Walter while Frank's men wrapped the old man in blankets. He buckled them onto himself. They were too small. He waded back into the river anyway, and he hooked the cable to the lift point Walter had described, and he came out of the water shaking so hard he could barely stand. And when he walked up the bank, he did not look at his recovery crew. He walked straight to Walter Brennan in the cab of Frank Halloran's truck with the heater running on high. It's hooked, Brad said. Thank you, Walter said. Mr. Brennan, I have an engineering degree. I have 11 years of heavy recovery experience. I would have walked away from this site at the end of the day, and the crane would still be in the river. So before you start that truck of yours, I want to say one thing. I'm sorry. Walter looked up at him from under the blanket. His lips were blue. He nodded. Help me to the autocar, Walter said. It took 2 men to get Walter into the driver's seat. He could not feel his feet on the pedals, but he knew the pedals from 46 years of muscle memory. He started the truck. The 6-cylinder engine caught on the second try and settled into the deep mechanical breathing that Stephen Brennan had heard 1,000 times in his garage in 1949. Walter engaged the winch. The drum began to turn, slow, mechanical. The cable went taut. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened. The recovery crew had stopped pretending to work. Every man on the site was watching. Frank Halloran stood next to the driver's window of the autocar with his hand on the door. Brad Pemberton stood 10 feet behind, still shaking in borrowed boots. The cable hummed under the load. Then very slowly, with a sound like the river itself exhaling the crane in the water, shifted 6 inches forward. Not enough, Brad said quietly. He did not say it to mock anymore. He said it because he was afraid. Walter Brennan, with his hands on a steering wheel he could barely feel, and his foot on a clutch he could not feel at all, looked through the windshield at the crane in the river and at the cable trembling in the air, and at the boom his father had welded together in a garage in 1949. Steel takes time, Walter said, and he held the winch steady. The first hour was the slowest hour of Frank Halloran's life. Walter Brennan worked the way his father had taught him to work, which was the way nothing in modern construction was done anymore. He pulled and he stopped. He repositioned the angle of the cable by a degree, sometimes by half a degree. He pulled again. He waited. He listened to the truck. He listened to the cable. He listened to the river. The crane moved an inch, then 6 inches, then nothing for 10 minutes, then a foot. Patience was not a strategy. Patience was the work. The men on the bank stopped talking after the first 30 minutes. Brad Pemberton sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket with a wool blanket around his shoulders and watched in a silence so complete it was almost reverent. 2 of his crew brought him hot coffee. He held the cup with both hands and did not drink it. He watched the cable. He watched the old man through the windshield of the autocar. He watched the crane in the river slowly work its way toward the shore. At 1 in the afternoon, the snow started. It came down hard from a sky that had been threatening it all morning, fat, wet flakes that turned to ice on the gravel and made every surface treacherous. The temperature dropped from 28 to 18 in 40 minutes. Frank Halloran walked over to the autocar's window. Mr. Brennan, we can stop. We can come back tomorrow. No, the weather is turning bad. The mud's loose now. The crane's moving. If I stop, the silt settles. The suction comes back. We start over. We don't have another day. Your insurance man comes Monday. I'd rather lose the crane than lose you. Walter Brennan turned his head and looked at Frank through the open window of the autocar, with snow falling between them. Mr. Halloran, you won't lose either. He went back to the winch. The work continued. The snow thickened until the far bank of the river disappeared into a wall of white. Frank Halloran could no longer see the top of the bridge piling on the other side. The construction crew rigged a tarpaulin over the access road and gathered under it with coffee that was already cold. Nobody left. Nobody suggested leaving. 43 men and 12 recovery workers and 1 site supervisor stood in the snow and watched an old man in a 60-year-old truck do work that none of them had ever seen done before. By 2 o'clock, the boom of the submerged crane had broken free of the river mud. Walter felt it through the cable before he saw it. The tension changed. The resistance lifted. Somewhere out in the white snow over the river, 80 tons of steel had stopped being a thing buried in earth and had become a thing floating in water. From here, the work would be different. From here, the work would be more dangerous. He worked another 40 minutes. Pull, hold, reposition. Pull, hold, reposition. The crane drifted toward the shore as much as it was pulled, the river current cooperating now with the cable instead of fighting it. Walter could see the counterweight rising and falling like a slow heartbeat as the boom pivoted on its base. The crane came up the bank at 2:47 in the afternoon. It did not come out cleanly. 40 feet from the bank, with the boom finally clear of the mud and the counterweight rising and falling like a slow heartbeat, there was a sharp metallic sound from somewhere inside the submerged cab. A snap. Something structural. The crane lurched sideways and the cable shrieked across the snatch blocks, and Frank Halloran felt his stomach drop into his boots. Walter stopped. Something gave. But Walter did not stop. Walter was listening to the sound the way Stefan had taught him to listen, and the sound was not the cable failing. The sound was a rusted brace inside the crane's cab, giving way as the angle of the load changed. 80 tons of steel was rebalancing itself. If Walter stopped, the crane would settle the wrong way, and the boom would snap, and the whole machine would roll into deep water where they would never get it out. Walter had 8 seconds. He shifted his angle, not by a degree, by a fifth of a degree. He pressed the throttle a fraction higher. He held the wheel of the autocar with hands he could barely feel, and the truck's frame groaned under the load, and the cable hummed across the snatch blocks, and the crane in the river settled, and then began to slide forward again. "Steel doesn't lie," Walter said quietly to himself, to his father, to nobody. "You just have to listen to it." The crane came up the bank. Mud and river water poured out of it in dirty rivers. The boom dragged a furrow 10 inches deep through the gravel. The whole thing came to rest on solid ground, tilted, leaking alive. Frank Halloran's crew did not cheer. They stood and stared and did not move. The recovery crew did not cheer either. Brad Pemberton stood up slowly from his bucket, and the blanket fell off his shoulders, and he did not pick it up. Walter Brennan set the parking brake on the autocar. He disengaged the winch. He sat in the cab for a long minute, looking through the windshield at what he had pulled out of the river. Then he climbed down the slow way, one careful step at a time. Frank Halloran walked toward him with his hand already in his coat pocket. "Mr. Brennan," "Mr. Halloran, you just saved my company. You just saved $12 million in contracts. You just saved 43 jobs." Walter said nothing. "I have an emergency fund. I have $5,000 on me in a check. Not your wage. Just a thank you." Walter shook his head. "Mr. Brennan, please, my wife is sick. I know what it means to need help. Please let me give you this." "Mr. Halloran, I won't take your money, but there is something I want to give you." Walter reached into the inside pocket of his work coat. He pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of old cloth. He unwrapped it slowly with hands that were still shaking. It was a military medal, bronze, tarnished. The ribbon was faded almost to gray. The shape of it was familiar to Frank Halloran even before he understood why. It was a bronze star, a medal from the Second World War. On the back of it, etched into the metal in careful letters, was a name: Edward Halloran. Frank Halloran stopped breathing. "Mr. Brennan, where did you get this?" "Your father gave it to mine. In 1962, on a riverbank 20 miles south of here on the Monongahela, a coal barge broke loose and rammed his dock. His Mercury sedan went into the water. He had no money to pay a wrecker. He gave my father this medal as thanks." My father pulled the car out. They sat on the bank after two men who didn't know each other, and they talked about the war and the mills and their sons. My father came home that night and put this medal in a drawer in his workshop. He told me, "One day you'll give this back." I didn't know to whom. I didn't know when. Frank Halloran took the medal from Walter's hand. His own hand was shaking now, and it was not from the cold. My father died in 1985. He never told me this story. Men of that generation didn't always tell the stories. I'm sorry. "Mr. Brennan, I don't know what to say." "Walter, please, my name is Walter." "Walter, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Build your bridge. Take care of your wife. The medal belonged in your family. My father just held it for 46 years. Frank Halloran stood on a snowy riverbank in January of 1998 with his father's bronze star in his hand and an 80-ton crane standing dripping behind him and a 73-year-old man in front of him whose father had pulled his father's car out of a river 36 years earlier. And he understood for the first time that the world worked in ways that did not show up on construction blueprints. He hugged Walter Brennan. Walter, who had not been hugged by a man in a long time, who had not been hugged by anyone since Margaret died, stood very still inside the embrace and did not move and did not breathe and let it happen. Then Walter Brennan went home. It took him an hour and a half to drive back to Homestead in the snow with the autocar's heater on full. He pulled into the garage. He shut off the engine. He sat in the cab for a long time looking at the dashboard his father had bolted in place in 1949. The snow ticked against the metal roof of the garage. The engine cooled with the small metallic sounds engines make when they have finished hard work. Walter put his forehead against the steering wheel and closed his eyes. He did not cry. He had not cried since the morning Margaret died, but he sat there with his forehead on the steering wheel for a long time, and when he finally got out of the truck, his legs would not hold him, and he had to lean against the fender for 2 full minutes before he could walk to the house. He did not sell the autocar. He took the bill of sale out of his coat pocket, and he carried it into the kitchen, and he dropped the 8 torn pieces into the trash can next to the refrigerator. He picked up the phone and he called Dennis Karchner in Greensburg, and he apologized and he told Dennis that the truck was not for sale anymore. Dennis Karchner was quiet for a moment, and then Dennis Karchner said he understood. Some trucks were not meant to be sold. Walter said thank you, and he hung up. Then he made a pot of coffee for one, and he sat at the kitchen table across from the empty chair where Margaret had sat for 48 years, and he looked at the photograph of his father, and he said out loud in his empty kitchen, "Pop, we did it." The next morning, Walter woke at 5 o'clock as he always did. The snow had stopped during the night. Pittsburgh lay under 6 inches of new white and a sky that had cleared to a hard, cold blue. Walter made his coffee. He looked at the empty chair. He looked at the photograph. He thought about Frank Halloran on the riverbank with a bronze star in his hand, and he thought about Brad Pemberton walking into a frozen river in his shirt and socks, and he thought about his father. And for the first time in 3 years, the kitchen did not feel empty. The phone rang at 7:45. It was a man named Donald Vasheko. He owned a small trucking outfit in Beaver County. He had a cement truck that had broken through the ice on a quarry pond 2 days earlier. The recovery companies wanted $40,000 in 3 weeks. He had heard about Walter Brennan from a man named Frank Halloran. He wanted to know if Walter would come look. Walter said yes. He was at the quarry pond by 10 o'clock. The cement truck was sitting in 9 feet of water with its cab tilted backward and its cylinder still slowly turning because the operator had forgotten to shut it off when the ice gave way. The operator was a young man named Eddie Vasheko, Donald's nephew, who had walked back to the office in wet boots and a wetter expression. The Pemberton Company had been out the day before and had said the quarry walls were too narrow for their cranes. The walls were old strip mine cuts, sandstone and shale, and they ran almost vertically down to the water on 3 sides. Walter walked the rim of the quarry for 30 minutes. He looked at the angles. He looked at the ice. He looked at the truck. He came back to Donald Vasheko and he said, "I need to anchor to the bedrock on the high side. I'll run cable down the face of the cut with snatch blocks pinned to the rock. I can't lift it out vertical. I have to drag it up the slope at an angle. It'll come up slow. The cab will scrape. The truck won't be pretty when I'm done. I don't care if it's pretty. I care if it's mine. Then it'll be yours tomorrow morning. Daylight." He charged Donald Vasheko $300. Donald Vasheko offered him $3,000. Walter took the $300 and waved off the rest. That afternoon, Walter drove back to Homestead with the autocar's heater on and the radio off, and he thought about the work. He had not thought about work in this way in 7 years. Not the way of an old man remembering. The way of a working man planning. He pulled into the driveway at 4 o'clock, and instead of going into the house, he went into the garage, and he checked the cable for kinks, and he greased the winch drum, and he inspected every snatch block in his tool chest, and he laid out the rigging he would need in the morning. He did this work for 2 hours in the cold garage with a single bare bulb hanging from the rafters, and the work made him warm in a way that the kitchen stove never did. When he finally went into the house, Margaret's chair was still empty, but it did not feel like an absence. It felt like a memory. He called the cement truck job a small one, and he was right. The next morning at 6 o'clock, he was rigging on the high side of the quarry by the light of a single floodlight Donald Vasheko had set up on a generator. The temperature was 11 degrees. The wind across the open mine pit was steady at 20 miles an hour. Walter wore 3 layers under his work coat and a wool watch cap pulled low over his ears, and he moved among the rocks and cable with the patient efficiency of a man whose body had done this work in worse weather than this. By 8, he had 3 blocks pinned to the bedrock and a fourth set up at the lip of the quarry where the cable would change direction and run down to the autocar. By 9, he was in the cab. By 9:15, the cement truck was moving. The truck came up the slope the way a body comes up out of a memory, slow, reluctant, heavy with everything it had been through. Walter worked the winch in long, careful pulls, stopping every few feet to listen, letting the cable cool between pulls so the tension would not heat the steel beyond its limits. The cab of the cement truck scraped against the sandstone face of the cut. The cylinder, still slowly turning, rang against the rock like a slow bell. The truck rose out of the water at the rate of a foot a minute. Eddie Vasheco stood at the rim of the quarry, watching his hands press flat against his cheeks like a child watching a magic trick. At 10:30, the cement truck reached the lip of the quarry. Walter held the cable steady, while Donald and Eddie and 2 other men got chains under it and dragged it the last 15 feet to flat ground. The cab was scraped down to bare metal in places. One mirror was missing. The cylinder was still turning, but the truck was on dry land and the truck was alive. Walter shut down the autocar. He climbed out of the cab. He let Donald Vasheco shake his hand for a long time. "How did you know to anchor at the top of the cut?" Eddie asked. He was 24 years old and he had never seen anything like what he had just seen. "You go where the rock is solid," Walter said. "The rest of it is just patience." He drove home with $300 in his pocket and the radio playing big band music from a Pittsburgh station that still ran a morning program of Swing and Dorsey and Glenn Miller, and he was happier than he had been since his wife was alive. That was the way it went for 6 years. Word travels in the construction and recovery community. Word traveled in small towns and old men's coffee shops and union halls and the back offices of insurance companies. By spring of 1998, Walter Brennan was getting 2 calls a month. By winter of 1999, he was getting 1 a week. He never advertised. He never raised his rates. He took the calls he could take, and he turned down the ones that were beyond him, and he was honest about which was which. He pulled a bulldozer out of a strip mine in Washington County in March of 1998 on a slope so steep that the operator had had to be airlifted off the dozer the night before. He pulled a tractor trailer out of a ravine off the Pennsylvania Turnpike in May of that year, working through a guardrail and around an old-growth maple tree without breaking either. He pulled a fishing boat off a sandbar in the Ohio River in October. He pulled a hay baler that had rolled into a creek bed in Westmoreland County in November and ended up staying for dinner at the farmer's house, where the farmer's wife served him pot roast and apple pie and asked him questions about his late wife with the gentle directness of a woman who had also lost a spouse and knew there was no point being delicate about it. He pulled a horse out of an old well shaft in Greene County in 1999. The horse, a brown mare named Penny, had stepped on a rotted plank covering an abandoned well on a farm her owner had only owned for 2 years. The well was 30 feet deep. The horse had fallen the first 12 feet and gotten wedged against the stone walls. The local fire department had tried to lift her with straps and failed. They had called the local heavy equipment companies who had said no horse was worth what it would cost to do it right. Then somebody had given the owner Walter's number. Walter drove out to the farm in the rain. He looked down the well. He looked at the horse. He looked at the woman who owned the horse, a widow named Bernice Krall, who had been sitting on the lip of the well for 16 hours talking to her horse and refusing to leave. "How much?" Bernice asked. "How much horse?" "What? How much horse you got? How big?" 1,100 pounds. $100. Bernice Krall looked at him. "For $100 you can pull a horse out of a well. For $100 I can pull anything out of anywhere, long as it's worth pulling." He rigged a webbed cargo sling that Donald Vasheco had given him as a thank you the previous year. He ran the sling under Penny with the help of 2 of Bernice's neighbors who climbed down on a rope ladder. He worked the autocar's winch with the patience of a man working a winch 1 slow turn at a time. The mare came up out of the well at the rate of an inch every 5 seconds, with the sling supporting her ribs and her belly and her shoulders, and when she reached the surface she was alive and her legs would still work. And she looked at Walter Brennan with the wide, unblinking eyes of an animal who has been somewhere terrible and come back. Bernice Krall cried for 10 minutes. Walter sat on the running board of the autocar and let her cry. She paid him $100. She also gave him a quart jar of strawberry jam that she had put up the previous summer. Walter ate the gem on toast every morning for 3 weeks, and every morning he thought about the brown mare standing in a field somewhere, and the jam tasted better than any jam he had eaten since Margaret had died. The Pittsburgh Tribune-Review wrote a story about him in February of 2000. It was a small story, 6 paragraphs on the inside of the Sunday Metro section, with a photograph of Walter standing in front of the autocar in his garage. The headline was something like, "Old Wrecker, Old Hand, Old Pittsburgh." Walter did not read the article. He cut it out of the paper and put it on the refrigerator next to a photograph of Michael as a boy, and that was where it stayed. The article brought him 3 new calls. One of them was from a man named Brad Pemberton. It was the third time Brad had called Walter in 2 years. Brad called once or twice a month, sometimes about it, sometimes just to ask how Walter was. The calls were short. The calls were always polite. Walter understood that Brad was working something out inside himself, something that had started in a frozen river in January of 1998, and Walter let him work it. "Mr. Brennan." "Walter Brad." "Walter, I read the article." "Wasn't much to read." "I wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." There was a pause on the line. "I have a son. He's 17. He wants to come work for me this summer." I told him no. "Why?" "Because he wants to do it because his last name is on the building. He doesn't want to do it because he loves the work." Walter thought about this for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because he's never been in a wrecker yard. He's never gotten his hands dirty. He thinks heavy recovery is a video game played from an air-conditioned office." "Mr. Pemberton." "Brad." "Brad, bring him to my garage Saturday morning, 6 o'clock. There was another pause. "Walter, that's a generous offer, but I don't want to put you out." "He'll put himself out. I won't lift a finger. 6 o'clock Saturday morning. Bring him in work clothes." Brad Pemberton brought his son to Walter's garage at 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning in March of 2000. The son's name was Daniel. He was tall and thin and had his father's eyes and a haircut he had clearly chosen himself. He looked at the autocar with the polite disinterest of a teenager who had been forced to come to an old man's garage in the dark. Walter shook his hand. Walter said, "Today we will rebuild the rear differential on this truck. It will take us 9 hours. You will hand me tools when I ask. You will not speak unless I speak first. When we are done, you will know one thing about this truck that nobody else in the world knows. Do you understand?" Daniel Pemberton looked at his father. His father looked at the floor. Daniel looked at Walter. "Yes, sir," Daniel said. They rebuilt the rear differential of the autocar in 9 hours and 40 minutes. Walter spoke 14 times. Daniel spoke twice. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with grease on his hands and oil on his pants and a smear of axle grease across his cheek where he had scratched an itch, Daniel Pemberton looked up at the underside of the truck and asked, "Mr. Brennan, why is the ring gear cut at this angle?" It was a real question. It was a question from somebody who had stopped being bored and had started to see. Walter looked down at the boy and almost smiled. "Because your great-grandfather's generation built things to last," Walter said. "And they cut the gears at angles that modern factories don't bother with anymore. Pass me the torque wrench." Daniel Pemberton came back to Walter's garage every other Saturday for 2 years. Brad Pemberton paid for the parts and the materials. Walter did not charge for the time. By 2002, Daniel was running cable for Walter on small jobs. By 2003, he was rigging snatch blocks under Walter's supervision. He was studying engineering at Carnegie Mellon. He told his father he was going to go into heavy recovery after graduation, and Brad Pemberton, who had spent his life trying to talk his son into something quieter and safer, said, "All right." Walter Brennan started feeling the cold differently in the winter of 2003. It was not the kind of cold a coat could fix. It was the kind of cold that came from inside the chest that made breathing feel like breathing through a wet towel, that made a man stop halfway up his own back steps and put his hand against the wall and wait. He went to the doctor in February of 2004. The doctor was a young woman named Patel, who had been recommended to him by Donald Vacheco's wife. She listened to his heart for a long time, and she scheduled tests, and she called him 3 weeks later and asked him to come in to discuss the results. Walter sat in her office with his wool cap in his lap, and he listened. Congestive heart failure. Late stage. There were medications. There were procedures. There were options. He asked her how much time without the procedures. She said maybe a year, maybe less. He asked her how much time with the procedures. She said maybe 2 years, maybe a little more, with significant reduction in quality of life. Walter Brennan put his wool cap back on his head, and he thanked Dr. Patel for her honesty, and he drove the auto car home through a light spring rain. He did not tell anybody for 3 months. He kept taking calls. He pulled a hay wagon out of a creek in Indiana County in April. He pulled a dump truck off the shoulder of Interstate 79 in May. In June, he pulled a small fishing boat off a rock on the Conemaugh River, and Daniel Pemberton came with him and ran most of the cable, and Walter sat on the running board of the auto car in the sunshine and watched the boy work and felt his chest squeeze and his breath go short, and he did not say anything. In July, he called Michael. Michael Brennan was sitting at a desk in an office building in downtown Saddle when his secretary put through a call from his father. They had spoken 3 times that year. Christmas, his birthday, a short call in March about nothing in particular. Michael had been writing code for a company that he was beginning to suspect did not have very long to live, and his mind was on layoffs and stock options and the price of his condominium in Belltown. And when his father's voice came on the line, his first thought was something is wrong. Dad. Mike, is something wrong? Yes. A pause. A long pause. What is it? My heart. Doctor says a year, maybe a little more if I take pills that make me feel like I'm not myself. I'm not going to take the pills. Michael Brennan put his hand over his face in his office in Seattle, and he did not say anything for a long time. When they said the average is a year, I'm 79. Average doesn't always apply. Could be 6 months. Could be 18. Dad, Michael, I'm not calling to be sad. I'm calling because I want to ask you something. Anything. I want you to come home for a week. Not now, in October. The fall colors will be on the river bluffs. I want to drive you out to a quarry pond in Beaver County. I want to show you where I pulled a cement truck out of 9 feet of water in 1998. I want to show you the bridge over the Allegheny that's there because your grandfather built me a truck in 1949. I want you to see it once. Then if you never come back, you'll have seen it. Michael Brennan was 47 years old and a software engineer at a company that paid him $300,000 a year, and he had not cried in front of another human being since he was 11. He cried into the phone for a full minute. His father waited on the other end of the line, patient as a winch. I'll come in October, Michael said. Good. Dad, I'm coming for longer than a week. Michael, I'm coming for as long as you need me there. Walter Brennan in the kitchen in Homestead with the photograph of his father over the table and the empty chair across from his, looked at the empty chair and said, all right, son, October. Michael Brennan flew into Pittsburgh on the 3rd of October. He had told his employer he needed 3 months of leave. The employer had said the company could not hold his position. Michael had said, all right. He had sold most of what he owned in Seattle in 2 weeks. The condominium would close in November. He had put everything else in storage. He arrived at the small house in Homestead with 2 suitcases and a folder of paperwork, and the look of a man who had finally made a decision he had been postponing for 23 years. Walter met him at the airport in the auto car. Michael stood in the loading zone with his suitcases and stared at the old truck and at the old man behind the wheel, and Walter rolled down the window and said, if you want to ride in a cab with heat, you should have flown to a different city. And Michael laughed for the first time in 3 weeks and threw his suitcases in the bed and climbed up into the passenger seat, and they drove home together through a Pittsburgh that Michael had not properly looked at in 23 years. The river bluffs were red and gold. The light over the steel mill ruins was the soft kind of late autumn light that only happens for 2 weeks a year. Walter drove slowly. Michael looked out the window and did not say much. When they pulled into the driveway in Homestead, Michael said, Dad, the truck is even louder than I remembered. That's because you've been listening to a computer fan for 10 years, Walter said. Michael Brennan stayed for the rest of his father's life. He did not go back to Seattle. He sold the condominium by mail. He moved into his old room in the small house in Homestead, the room with the boyhood trophies and the rock posters that Margaret had never taken down. He learned to make coffee for 2. He learned to listen to a police scanner at 6 in the morning. He learned slowly the difference between an autocar idol that sounded right and an autocar idol that did not. He drove his father to 2 more jobs in October, a stuck delivery truck near Murraysville, and a stranded grader on a logging road outside Indiana. And on the second job, he ran the winch under his father's instruction while his father sat on a folding camp chair in the sun and watched him work. The third job, in early November, Walter could not get out of the cab. He sat in the cab while Michael set the rigging. He talked Michael through the angles. He worked the winch with hands that had become very thin. They pulled a small farm tractor out of a culvert on a property owned by a man named Mervyn Ostrowski, and at the end of the job, Mervyn shook Walter's hand and gave him $50 and a jar of honey from his own bees, and Walter held the jar of honey in his lap on the drive home and looked out the window and said nothing for the entire 40-mile trip. The fourth job was on the 18th of December, and Michael drove the auto car by himself. Walter stayed home. It was the first time in 55 years that the autocar had gone out to a job without a Brennan named Stefan or Walter in the cab. Michael came back 6 hours later with a check for $200 and the look of a man who had pulled a boat off a sandbar in the Monongahela in 12-degree weather and discovered something he had not known about himself. Walter sat in his kitchen with the photograph of Stefan over the table and the empty chair where Margaret had sat and the small camp chair in the corner where he now spent most of his afternoons, and he looked at his son and he said, "How did it go?" "It went," Michael said. "It went the way you said it would. You repositioned the angle 3 times. Steel takes time. Steel takes time." They sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, and a wet snow fell outside the kitchen window, and Walter Brennan watched his son drink coffee at the kitchen table and felt for the first time in many years that the chair across from him was no longer empty. Walter Brennan died on a Sunday afternoon in late October of 2004. He had not made it through another winter. He died in his own bed in the small house in Homestead, with his son Michael holding one hand and a hospice nurse holding the other. He was 79 years old. The doctor said it was congestive heart failure. Michael Brennan, who had stayed in Pittsburgh for 13 months and who had run 31 record jobs in the autocar in his father's last year, said it was that his father had finally finished what he came here to do. The funeral was on a Thursday at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Homestead. Michael had expected maybe 20 people, his mother's surviving sisters, a few neighbors, some old men from the mill. 47 men from Halloran Construction came in a chartered bus. They wore work coats over their suits, and they sat in the back pews, and when the priest asked who would speak about Walter, Frank Halloran stood up and walked to the pulpit with his hand around a small bronze medal in his pocket, and he told the church about a January morning in 1998 and an old wrecker and a man who had pulled a crane out of the Allegheny River for nothing more than the chance to do the work his father had taught him. He told the church about Catherine, who was sitting in the second row in remission for 4 years now, holding their first grandchild on her lap, a baby boy named Walter Halloran, who was 18 months old and had no idea why the church was full of crying men. Brad Pemberton sat in the second row and he cried. His son Daniel sat next to him in a black suit that did not quite fit him at the shoulders because he had not yet stopped growing into the body of a working man, and Daniel cried too, and Brad put his hand on his son's shoulder and did not move it for the rest of the service. Donald Vasheko came. Eddie Vasheko came. Bernice Krall came in a black dress and a black wool coat, and she sat in a back pew with a small framed photograph of a brown mare on her lap. Mervyn Ostrowski came. The farmer from Westmoreland County whose wife had served pot roast came with his wife. 2 old men from Jones and Laughlin Steel who had not seen Walter in 20 years came in suits that had not been worn since the funerals of their own wives. Dr. Patel came. The receptionist from Halloran Construction came. Dennis Karshner came down from Greensburg. Michael Brennan looked at the church full of strangers and not strangers, and he understood all at once what his father had been doing for 28 years after his grandfather died. The truck had not been a hobby. The truck had not been a sad attachment to a dead man. The truck had been a way for one man to be present in the lives of 300 other people for half a century. The truck had been a verb, not a noun. Walter Brennan had spent the last 6 years of his life pulling other people out of holes in the ground and out of the bottom of rivers and out of slow private despair, and the people in the church were all the people he had touched, and there were more of them than Michael had ever imagined. After the funeral, Michael Brennan stayed in Pittsburgh for 2 months. He went through his father's house. He went through his father's garage. He stood next to the auto car with his hand on the boom his grandfather had welded together in 1949. And he understood for the first time what the truck was and what his father had spent his last years protecting and what he was being asked to do with it now. He could not keep it the way his father had kept it. He had to go back to work eventually. He had a life that he had built somewhere else even if he was no longer sure he wanted to go back to it. He could not run record jobs from Seattle. He could not run them from anywhere, really, because he did not have his father's skill, and a wrecker without the skill of a man like Walter Brennan was just an old truck. He called Daniel Pemberton. Daniel was a sophomore at Carnegie Mellon by then, 20 years old, taking a course in structural engineering, and another in civil engineering, and a third in what the program called heavy mechanical systems. He drove down to Homestead on a Saturday morning in December, and he stood in Walter Brennan's garage with his hand on the boom of the autocar, and he said nothing for a long time. Daniel, Michael said, "I can't run this truck. I don't know how. I live in Seattle. I have a life there that I have not yet decided what to do with. My father taught you for 4 years. He didn't teach me. I don't think he meant to leave it to me. I think he meant to leave it to you." Daniel Pemberton looked at the truck, and then he looked at Michael Brennan. "Mr. Brennan, I can't take this truck. Your father left it to you." "My father did not leave instructions. My father died in his sleep on a Sunday afternoon with his hand in mine, and he did not say a single word about what to do with the truck. I'm telling you what I know. I know I can't run it. I know you can. I know my father would rather it ran than rusted." Daniel was quiet for a long time. "Mr. Brennan, there's another option." "What is it?" "The Heinz History Center, the Senator John Heinz History Center in the Strip District. They have a permanent exhibit on Pittsburgh industry. They've been looking for working-class artifacts, not parade trucks, trucks that did work, trucks with stories. I think they would take this one." "Would they keep it running?" "They would keep it preserved, not running, but the placard would be your grandfather's name and your father's name and what they did. People would walk past it for 100 years and they would know what it was." Michael Brennan stood in the garage and looked at the truck his grandfather had built in 1949 and his father had run for 28 years, and he thought about it for a long time. "If I gave it to the museum," he said, "would you ever forgive me for taking it away from the work?" Daniel Pemberton looked at his shoes and then he looked at the truck. "Mr. Brennan, your father taught me everything I know about heavy recovery, but he also taught me one thing about himself. He told me the third Saturday I came to work in this garage that the truck was just a truck. The work was the point. Your grandfather built the truck because there was work that needed doing. Your father ran the truck because there was work that needed doing. There's still work that needs doing, and Pemberton Heavy Recovery is going to do it. I'm going to do it. With our equipment. Modern cranes, hydraulic systems, your father's principles. The truck doesn't have to keep working. The work just has to keep happening." Michael Brennan put his hand against the cold steel of the boom, and he closed his eyes. "Call the museum," he said. The Autocar DC-100 was donated to the Senator John Heinz History Center on the 18th of March 2006. The donation took the form of a small ceremony in the loading dock of the museum's storage facility in the Strip District. Michael Brennan flew in from Seattle. Frank Halloran came. Catherine came. Brad Pemberton came. Daniel Pemberton, now a senior at Carnegie Mellon, came. The young woman who had written the article in the Tribune Review 6 years earlier came as a private citizen and stood in the back with her hands in her coat pockets and did not take any notes. Michael Brennan turned over the keys to the curator, a woman named Lillian Foltz, who held them with both hands like a relic. He turned over the photograph of Stephan and Walter from 1951 in its wooden frame. He turned over a small wooden box that contained Stephan's welding gloves from 1949, blackened from the I-beam scrap he had carried out of the mill at the end of his shifts. He turned over a notebook in which his father had written in pencil every job the truck had performed from 1976 to 2004, with the date and the location and the load and the payment, if any. The notebook contained 478 entries. The Autocar DC-100 was restored over the next 18 months by a team of volunteers, most of whom had worked at Jones and Laughlin Steel, most of whom had known Walter or had known of him. They did not change anything that mattered. They cleaned 42 years of working grime off the boom. They polished the original paint. They left the dents and the welds and the patches. They left the small scratch on the driver's side door that Stephan had put there in 1962 when he had hooked the cable wrong on a Mercury sedan recovery and the cable had whipped free. They left the slightly bent rear bumper that Walter had put there in 1985 when he had backed into a coal yard fence in McKeesport. They left the place under the driver's seat where Walter had carved his wife's initials with a pocket knife on the day Margaret died. It sits today on the fourth floor of the Heinz History Center in the Made in Pittsburgh exhibit between a 1920s steel ladle and a hand-stamped lunch pail from the J&L Steel Aliquippa Works. The placard reads in part, Autocar D, C100 Wrecker, chassis from 1948, Boomin Custom Fabrication by Stephen Brennan, 1949, operated by Stephen Brennan from 1950 to 1976, operated by his son Walter Brennan from 1976 to 2004, donated in 2006 by Michael Brennan in memory of his father and grandfather. This truck pulled an 80-ton crane from the Allegheny River on the 22nd of January, 1998, when a 200-ton modern recovery crane could not do the job. Over its working life, it performed more than 400 recovery jobs in western Pennsylvania, often without payment for working men and women who had nowhere else to turn. Beneath that in smaller letters is a quote, "Build it with your hands. Use it for the hard jobs. The hard jobs always come back." Stephen Brennan to his son, 1976. The Riverside Bridge opened in October of 1998. It carries traffic over the Allegheny River 7 miles north of Pittsburgh. Frank Halloran's company built it. The dedication ceremony was attended by the governor and a congressman and 150 members of the trade unions, and Frank Halloran gave a short speech in which he thanked his crew and his subcontractors and a man named Walter Brennan, and most of the people in the crowd did not know who Walter Brennan was, and that was all right, because the ones who needed to know did. Halloran Construction is still in business. Frank Halloran retired in 2014 and turned the company over to his son and daughter, both of whom went into the trade in their 20s because they had grown up listening to their father talk about a January morning in 1998 when an old man saved everything. Catherine Halloran is alive as of this telling. She is a grandmother 3 times over. She volunteers at a cancer support center in Shadyside, and she keeps her father-in-law's bronze star in a small box on her dresser, next to a photograph of a brown mare she has never met named Penny. Pemberton Heavy Recovery is also still in business, and it is the largest heavy recovery company in western Pennsylvania. Brad Pemberton retired in 2018. The company is now run by his son Daniel, who learned heavy recovery on a Saturday morning in March of 2000 in an old man's garage in Homestead, and who tells every new hire on their first day that the first thing they need to understand about the work is that steel takes time. Daniel keeps a small framed photograph on the wall of his office. The photograph shows an old Autocar DC 100 wrecker parked at the edge of an icy river with a 73-year-old man standing next to it in a wool cap and a 43-year-old contractor and a 38-year-old engineer standing on either side of him and a recovered 80-ton crane dripping mud in the background. Brad Pemberton wrote a letter to Michael Brennan in 2007. The letter was 3 pages long. It said many things, most of them about Walter, but the last paragraph was about Daniel. The last paragraph said that Daniel was the man Brad had always hoped to be, and that Brad had not been able to make him that, and that Walter Brennan had. Brad signed the letter with his full name and his title, and a single line in his own handwriting at the bottom that read, "Thank you for your father." Michael Brennan keeps that letter in a drawer in a small condominium in Seattle where he still lives, where he no longer writes computer code, but instead works for a small nonprofit organization that helps older workers transition into skilled trades. He took the job in 2007. He took a 60% pay cut to take it. He has never been happier. If you stand in front of the Autocar long enough on a quiet weekday afternoon when the museum is mostly empty, you can almost hear it. The deep mechanical breathing of a 6-cylinder engine designed before the Korean War, the slow turn of a winch drum, the hum of cable underload, the voice of an old man in the cab saying steel takes time. In the summer of 2019, a class of 5th graders from the Hill District visited the Heinz History Center on a field trip. Their teacher was a young man named Mr. Stallings, who had grown up in McKeesport and whose grandfather had worked at the same blast furnace where Stephen Brennan had worked in the late 1940s. Mr. Stallings stopped his class in front of the Autocar and read the placard out loud. The class listened. Most of them at age 11 were more interested in the dinosaurs on the 2nd floor than in an old truck on the 4th. One boy stayed behind after the class moved on. He was maybe 10 years old. He was small for his age, with curly hair and a backpack that was too big for him. He stood in front of the Autocar for a long time. He read the placard twice. He looked up at the boom, all 24 feet of it rising above the truck bed. Then he asked his teacher, who came back to find him, "Mr. Stallings, did he really pull a whole crane out of a river with that truck?" Mr. Stallings looked at the placard and at the truck and at the boy. "Yes," he said, "he really did." "How?" Mr. Stallings thought about it for a moment. He was not a heavy recovery man. He had never run a winch in his life. But he was a teacher in the Hill District, and he had read the placard, and he knew the way teachers know what the boy was really asking. "Patience," Mr. Stallings said, "and the right angle, and a truck that his father built for him 50 years before." The boy nodded slowly. He looked at the truck again. He adjusted the straps of his backpack. Then he ran to catch up with his class. Outside the museum, the river was running gray under a pale autumn sky. The bridges over the Allegheny and the Monongahela and the Ohio were carrying traffic in and out of a city that no longer made steel, but that still made things, still moved things, still pulled things out of holes when holes opened up under them. 40 miles to the southeast, in a small frame house on a hill above the Monongahela in Homestead, a different family lived now, with different curtains in the kitchen and different photographs on the wall, and a kitchen table that was not for Micah anymore. But in the garage behind the house, which the new owners used to store a Honda Civic and some cardboard boxes, there were still scorch marks on the concrete floor in two places where a Slovak immigrant named Stefan Brennan had set down red-hot pieces of steel beam in 1949, while he welded together a custom boom for a wrecker truck that he believed, with the unreasoning faith of working men everywhere, would one day be needed. He was right. He was right twice. Once on a flooded riverbank in 1962, when he had pulled out a Mercury sedan that belonged to a man named Edward Halloran. And once 36 years later on a frozen riverbank 7 miles north of Pittsburgh, when his son had pulled out an 80-ton crane that belonged to Edward Halloran's son and had given back in the same hour a Bronze Star that had been waiting in a drawer in McKeesport for 46 years to find its way home. The engineers laughed. The steelworker pulled. And 50 years of welded boom built in a garage in Homestead, Pennsylvania, by a man who never finished high school, beat 4 days of modern failure in the freezing water of a Pennsylvania river. That is what happens when a man builds something with his hands for the hard jobs and keeps it running for the day when the hard jobs come back. That is what happens when a son honors his father's work by using it the way it was meant to be used. That is what happens when an old man with old iron proves that sometimes knowledge and patience beat power in technology. And that is what happens when a promise made on a riverbank in 1962 by two men who would never meet again is kept by their sons in 1998 on a different river on a colder morning in the only currency that working men have ever fully trusted: the work. The work given freely between men who understand without needing to say it that some debts are not paid back. Some debts are paid forward across years and across rivers and across the long, quiet generations of working hands until they come back around. And then a man stands on a snowy riverbank with a bronze medal in his palm, and the world is briefly visible as the connected place it has always been. Walter Brennan died in his own bed on a Sunday in late October, with the windows open to a wind that smelled like coming snow. His last words spoken to his son were too quiet for the hospice nurse to hear. Michael Brennan has never told anyone what they were. He has been asked by reporters and by friends, and once by Frank Halloran on the steps of the church after the funeral, and every time he has shaken his head and looked away and changed the subject. But when Daniel Pemberton's son, born in 2021 and named for two grandfathers, asks him someday what the old man said at the end, Michael Brennan has decided that he will tell him. He will say that Walter Brennan, in the last clear minute of his life, looked up at his son with eyes that had finally finished their work and said, "Tell them I listened to the steel. Tell them the steel told me what to do. Tell them anybody can do it if they are willing to listen long enough." Then he closed his eyes and the windows let in the wind, and the wind smelled like coming snow, and somewhere west of the house on the fourth floor of a museum in Pittsburgh, a 1948 autocar DC 100 wrecker sat in the silent dark with his custom boom rising above its bed, waiting the way it had always waited for the next hard job that the modern world would not be able to do.